One thing I was going to talk about, we all know that Noah's Ark landed in the mountains of Ararat. Some years ago I had a grand privilege to visit Armenia. And the rest of you been to Armenia? I had never been there. It's a tiny little country. Mount Ararat itself is actually not in Armenia. It kind of used to be. It's right on the border, and we were able to go right to the border and look right across beautiful mountains, 17,000 feet high, in a desert, almost desert environment. We climbed Mount Ararat, which I'd never heard of before. It's a sister to Mount Ararat. And you know, it's interesting, if you read Scripture, it doesn't say Noah's Ark landed on Mount Ararat. What does it actually say? In the mountains of Ararat. Ellen White says that it landed in a group of mountains in kind of a cove, and it was protected there for a long time. The group I went with, I agreed that I wouldn't tell you about that part of the trip. Until I get that permission, I can't. But, excuse me, what I can tell you about is the country of Armenia and how it affects country living. What happened after the flood? Because you remember, as we talked this morning, God's purpose in the flood was to keep people from congregating in cities. That was his main purpose. And to make it more difficult to grow food so that people didn't have so much leisure time to get in trouble, to put it simply. That's what it was all about. And it's taken 4,000 years for the world to get to the place where mechanized agriculture has made it possible in the developed world for the vast majority of people to have virtually all the leisure time they want. They don't need to grow food anymore. Public utilities make it so you don't have to worry about being cold or having water. All the basics of life are pretty much taken care of. And because of that, most people are getting in trouble spiritually. Some of them are just plain getting in trouble. I had, you read these things in history books, you look in geography books about the area around Mount Ararat and why people landed where they did and so on. Until you go there, it doesn't make as much sense. But to get to Armenia, we flew to London, and then from there took British Airways across the Black Sea. Black Sea is huge. It really is large. And we landed not in Armenia, but in Georgia. And I'll never forget, it was a regular, normal British Airways jet, but it's a very small runway, and it is very rough. And we came in like this and then just dove straight down and just kind of like pancaked hard, and the brakes went on really hard, and it was this. And I went up, we were wondering what was going on, and we looked across, we landed a long ways out. This is in Georgia now. From the little tiny terminal, and there were guards everywhere with machine guns. I mean, imagine if you land in any town in North America and guys with machine guns running everywhere. It was like, and we stopped. They brought nothing out except a stairway. You don't know nice little jetways and all this sort of stuff. And then the pilot saw him. He came out of the cockpit. He walked down. Everybody was supposed to stay on board unless you had some reason to get off in this country. And he walked down. Well, the friend of mine that was with me, we wanted to say we had touched Georgian soil. Just click off another country, and I'm always curious what's going on. So we walked out and just kind of acted nonchalant, walked down the steps, and the pilot was there, and we asked him, why can't anybody get off? He said, well, they're under military control here. We don't want to bother them. If there's any problems at all, they may not let us take off. We do land here, it's on our stop, and everything's fine, but he said, every time I land here, it is so rough. I always get out and I walk the entire plane to make sure we didn't blow a tire or hurt one of the struts or something, because it's a terrible runway. So I said, while you do that, Is it all right if my friend and I come down and we just sort of casually step off the last step a little bit and act important and then walk back up? He said, sure, that's all right. So we did that. I learned something though. Georgia is on the north side of the Caucasus. Armenia is on the south side. There's a reason why God had people land where they did. Because we got to remember, the folks that were on the boat, there were only 8 of them, they had just come from a tropical environment, right? Never rained. It was sunshine all the time. It was it was nice warm weather, clear of the poles. There were no great seas. We're told that. Remember in Revelation it says there will be no more sea, because there were no seas to begin with. There were large bodies of water, but nothing like oceans that separated everybody. So when they got off the boat finally, which way to go? If they went west, they ran into the Black Sea. And if they went east, they ran into the Caspian Sea. If they went north, they ran into the Caucasus, which go up to 18,000 feet. And I know this was just moments after the flood, so to speak, and things were kind of cooling down. But I'm just imagining now, some of them went that way, and they came back and said, it's cold up there. Because on the other side is essentially Russia and the great Siberian steppe, clear to the North Pole. And the only logical place to go was to hike south. And the farther they went, it was kind of like what they knew before. It never rained. It's the Iraqi-Iran plateau, and there's virtually no rain. But there were 2 rivers flowing out of the Caucasus. Almost, they're almost side by side. And it's called, of course, in history, it's called the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, which meso means between the rivers. And they said, this is perfect. And that's how the Tower of Babel came to be, because it was a climate, it was almost exactly as they knew before. No rain, but they had irrigation water and all that, and virtually they all congregated right there. And the Lord said, here we go again. Same thing that he was trying to keep them from, they all did again. And so that's why his next plan was to confound the languages. That lasted for 4,000 years. It was really almost in our day that finally the world was able to come to a place where you could have large cities. I've read in the Middle Ages, do you have any idea why London never got any bigger than it did, or Berlin, or Paris in the Middle Ages? They I don't know exact, but it was like maybe 100,000, 200,000, because the amount of horse drop and horse urine that was produced in a city even that size was so huge, and the work to carry it all out and get rid of it and so on, it was just not possible to have a big metropolis. That didn't really happen until the age of the automobile, and really the train first and then the automobile. People just didn't live in big cities. To Ellen White, Battle Creek was a big city. You know, remember, people ought to get out of this town, there's too many of us here. When she was saying all that and consider Battle Creek a city, how many people were living in Battle Creek in 1860 or 70 or 80? Do you have any idea? 10,000 or less. I did a whole sermon some years ago, a couple years ago, called Moving to Battle Creek. Because it's kind of a euphemism on, Ellen White always said we should move out of Battle Creek. We don't want any Jerusalem centers and all that, right? She didn't want anybody. We already have enough people here. Nobody, please, don't move to Battle Creek. Today, many of us are moving back to Battle Creek. And you may not agree with me on this, but what was the problem for Adventists having too many of them in Battle Creek? What was the problem?
Lazy.
They became complacent, they became lazy, but they also, if you read about it, they saw each other too much. And one lady would see another lady, and she had a new kind of bonnet on, and I want one of those. And then somebody else would see somebody else who had a horse and buggy that was just a little bit too nice. And all the young people were getting into early dating. I mean, there was just too many all in one place. And when you get sinners in one place, what usually predominates? Righteousness or sin? It's just too much temptation. And so, I mean, the Dime Tabernacle could hold 4,000 people. We hardly have any churches in the denomination now that big. I think Loma Linda's that big, and there's probably a couple of others here and there. She said, we don't need more Battle Creeks. So today, you can live in little old Polebridge or Cherryville and move to Battle Creek by spending too much time getting too connected to the point where your kids especially, I mean, they know everybody and what everybody's doing and what everybody's wearing and all the rest of it from all over the country. And that is, that's only happened in the last 10 years. Just 10 years, and the effect it has had. So I urge you, if you really want to live in the country, you've got to restrict the electronic access, especially for your children, but also for the adults. We just do. It's a real issue. And I thought about, too, the people at Ararat avoided the mountains. Now, some of them eventually went there because they became the Russian people. But the vast majority didn't, went another direction. Now, I wanted to read just a couple things again. Remember, we talked about the Lord sent Moses to the wilderness, to the mountains. Remember, he was in the bulwarks and he got patience and all that. Remember John the Baptist, he was out in the wilderness. This is one I didn't read. This is from Great Controversy. Behind the lofty bulwarks of the mountains, in all ages, the refuge of the persecuted and oppressed, the Waldensians found a hiding place. Here, the light of truth was kept burning amid the darkness of the Middle Ages. So the question in a way is why all the emphasis on mountains? Here's another one. This is from Country Living. Who will be warned? We say again, out of the cities, do not consider a great deprivation that you must go into the hills and mountains, but seek for that retirement where you can be alone with God. Why did the Lord emphasize, and Ellen White emphasize, that we shouldn't just be 3 miles out of town, but we should actually be in the hills and the mountains? And I've often thought about that. Hills and mountains are, in a way, they're a lot more difficult to live in. But here's, I think, the reason. Throughout history, after the flood, people have flocked basically to 3 places: valleys, river bottoms, which are sort of valleys too, and coastlines. Why have they done that? It's easier again. Rivers mean water, and we don't think of it. Today, people, I was talking to somebody here at lunch, we were talking about the fact people don't think anything going out and buying 20 acres on a dry hillside today. There's not a speck of water, and, well, we'll just drill a 300-foot well, 700-foot well, whatever. Not thinking that without modern electricity and modern pumps and all that, the chances of you getting the water out of that hole are going to be pretty slim. And pumps are notorious for going bad. And I've got a former student of mine who his whole business is repairing wells. And he's so full, and people call him by the dozens every day. And that's just the way it is. In the early days, people would never go out and homestead in a place where they didn't have access to some real water. Now, maybe a shallow well that they could dig and they could dip out of. I'm not saying you should never have a well, don't get me wrong, but we need to think those things through a little bit. And part of the reason is because mountains were difficult to farm, obviously. We were in Nepal for a little while, and they're farming mountains over there. When we were there were 22 million people living in a little country the size of Tennessee. And it's mostly mountainous. If they didn't farm, and you know how they do it, I mean, it's literally terraced up every hill and everything, trying to eke out an existence there. It's been difficult. So basically, mountains have been left alone. Even to this day, most of the areas, even in the developed world, that are really hilly and really mountainous, kind of like Montana and British Columbia, I was impressed just driving up here again, how beautiful it is in BC and how unpopulated most of it is, at least where I went. It's just mountains and hills everywhere. And it's hard to even get a road. I mean, it'd take me half the time if there was a straight road from here to home, and it's just not straight. Because of that, mountains have been underpopulated, and they have not been abused. To give you an example of how this works, when we first got out of college, we wanted to move to the country. We had just talking about it ourselves, but we didn't have any money. We knew we were going to have to work somewhere and save some money and all that. And so we took a job where we could both teach, and that job was in a desert in California. And we both graduated from Andrews University. And the first summer after our first year, we wanted to get some continuing education. You're required to do a little, and also they give you a higher certificate if you get yourself a little more educated. So we were down at La Sierra. Some of you know where that. Anybody been to La Sierra, to the college? It was in the country 100 years ago, but it's actually right on the edge of Riverside, and it's surrounded by city, urban area. One thing that struck us when we went there, I'd never been there before. I may have been by it, but not to go to school at all. We walked in, and there were some nice drinking fountains in the ad building and classroom building and so on. But there was a little sign by every drinking fountain. What do you suppose it said? If you have young children, if you are pregnant or a young mother, or you are elderly, don't drink this water. And I thought, well, I don't fall into any of those categories, but do I really want to drink this water? Why? It was so full of agricultural runoff, because the area around Riverside was full of feedlots, dairy farms, vast amount of farming. Today it's mostly been built up with city and so on. And they had so saturated the ground with herbicides and pesticides and fertilizers and nitrates and all the rest that you could not get well water there, or even city water that was suitable to drink. Another example of that is after we had finally bought I don't want to tell you the whole story, but we worked for 5 years without having children as teachers. Teachers didn't make a lot of money, but we carefully saved every dime we could so that we could get enough money to buy a piece of property, because we started broke. And I'm actually finding out being broke after college means you're rich. Because today most people after college are in debt, $50,000 to $100,000. It's a terrible scourge, but for us we were just broke. So we started from scratch, but after we bought the property, we lived on it 1 year, and I realized real quick that we needed a little more funds to develop. It was a wilderness. There was nothing on it but a broken down old homestead cabin. So we took a job teaching. We wanted to stay out of big schools. They actually offered us a job in Glendale, because I was a math teacher and so on. I didn't want to go there. In fact, I'll never forget the conference. Education superintendent said, I would like you to go there because we need a math teacher there, but I don't think you want to, because he knew where we wanted to go. And I said, no, I don't. And so we didn't. But we took this job in a little tiny church school in central Illinois, Alton, Illinois, if any of you know where that is. It's a farming area, and I told Linda, I'll never forget, it won't be that bad. We spent a year in our little cabin on our mountain property, and it was so wonderful. We hated to go, but I said, it'll be wonderful. We'll go out and find a little farmhouse somewhere nobody's using. We'll live out in the country, and we'll ranch, and work in this little school. There were only 6 kids in the school. The school was right in town. Wonderful, wonderful people, but mostly older folks. The church was slowly dying, and they had 6 little kids. And they were trying to have a church school there. And so we went. Well, we looked for farmhouses. Nobody lived in the country. I mean, there were big farmhouses, and big, but little old, there was nothing. So we ended up renting a place right across the alley from the church where the church school was. It was an older kind of Victorian home. The bottom was an apartment, and the top were 2 apartments that had been made, and there was an older lady that was running it, and we rented one of the upper ones. It was just the 2 of us. And we went in there, and she said, there's a little problem with some of the plumbing. It really needs to be done. I said, well, I can do that kind of thing. And so we need to put a new faucet in the tub. So I started working on the tub, and I took the pipes apart, and it was like a 1/2-inch pipe, but there was only like an 1/8 to 3/16 inch hole left in the middle, and the rest of it was this slimy gum, gooey stuff. And I said, what is this? So I dug in there with a screwdriver, but how many miles did it go? And I finally put it all together, and I had to do a couple other things, hooked it all up and filled the tub, and it was kind of yellowish. And I said, but in order to actually hook up and use water, because it hadn't been used for a while in the apartment, we had to go to the city water department and sign up for water service. So I went there, and I'll never forget the scene. I walked in there, and here was this little lady, a bureaucrat, sitting behind this desk, her head down, a bunch of papers, and there was a line of people. There were probably 6 here, and then I was in, and then a couple people came behind me eventually, waiting our turn. And without even looking up, she would say, name, she'd fill it in, address, fill it in, former water company for reference, fill that in, so on. That'll be, I forget what it was, $25 for your down payment, so on. Thank you, next. And it just went down the line like that, every one, until it got to me. And I walked up, same thing, you know, address, where you giving your name, and so on. Former water company. By this time, there were like 4 or 5 people in line behind me, and the kind of room was quiet. I said, well, I didn't really have a water service before because I was, you know, living out in the country, had my own place. He said, well, where were you living? I said, well, we were living on a little property way out in the mountains in Montana, and we had our own spring. At that moment, she looked up for the first time. She looked at me and she said, I can't repeat all the words she used. She said, what are you doing here? She said, you know what's in the water here? She says, we get the water, and all these people just like this, just we get our water straight out of the Mississippi River. Alton's right on the Mississippi River. We kill everything in it. There's no bacteria, but there's 60 chemicals that are dissolved in the water we can't get rid of. You don't want to use this water. And I was like, wow. And I thought of that what the angel said to Elijah, what doest thou here? There was an oil refinery in town. The whole place stunk to high heaven of rotten eggs and stuff. It was like these poor people. We stayed there for a whole school year. There were 6 kids, not one of them had ever been camping. We took them camping for the first time in their life. They loved it. You know, the people wanted us to stay, but I got so sick drinking that water. We were so scotched, trying to save every dime. I'm not going to buy water. We ended up buying distilled water to stay alive. I'll tell you one more story about why you want to live in the mountains instead of on a flat plain. That same area, we got to know some of the people in town. There was a young couple there that wanted to live in the country. They had found some property 20 miles out of town. Now that's not easy to do in Illinois because there's a lot of towns, but they were 20 miles from the nearest town. And they were out there trying to have a little bit of a country home for their family. They were on city water, 20 miles out. I never heard of that. Now maybe that's common around here, but it wasn't where in Montana. Why? Because it was a farming district. And again, the soil was so saturated with toxins and poisons that all the well water was so polluted they didn't want anybody to drink it. And they all got their water from the Mississippi River. They thought that was better, piped it 20 miles out to this place. I know some people in Tennessee right now that are 7 miles from town. They're on city water. You've got to be careful. here, I didn't see that much agriculture coming up here. There is some. There are beautiful orchards here and there and so on, but not these vast fields where everybody's spreading stuff. You have to be careful. The reason I think the Lord has told us in the 1800s to move to the mountains is because the mountains are the watershed. That's where the water lands first. And if you get it first, it's pure, but it doesn't stay pure very long. When we were living there in Southern California, I read in a paper somewhere that in that part of California, and I realize California is not typical of everywhere, they said, and I hope nobody's squeamish here, and we've already had our dinner, but they said that the average person there, the water they drank, if they drank city water, had already been through 17 other bodies before you got it. Now it was all treated, if you believe all that, and it was clean and all that, and stuff was dead, but a lot of stuff was still in there. That's why you want to be the first guy to get the water. So if you go out and look for land somewhere, don't buy land, this is my opinion, about 4 miles downstream from a bunch of ranches, because the cattle are all going to be swimming in the water, and there's going to be alfalfa and hay, and you know what happens. It's better to be out where you get it first. And to tell you a story about that, what that means is when we moved to Montana where we are, there's no agriculture. There was one ranch in the whole valley about 12 miles south of us or so. We have some springs in our place. That's why we bought it. There are beautiful springs on it. And they are gravity-fed springs. They come out up on the hill, so we can pipe it down, no pumps, nothing. Beautiful water. I had never actually had it tested, but I knew that it must be pretty good because when we first started drinking the water, it tasted like just pure, clean water. No aftertaste, no mineral taste, nothing. Just beautiful, wonderful water. And because even a lot of well water can have iron and sulfur and calcium and all this stuff. But we have a couple neighbors there. We have about 38 acres, and there was another family there. They only came like a week or two a year. They came from Minnesota. They were wonderful Christian people, and they lived in Red Wing. They were well-to-do people, and this was kind of their little summer getaway cabin. And eventually, they and 3 other families in the area hired Linda and I to put in a water system after they saw we put one in for ours. There was another spring in the National Forest behind us. It wasn't on our property, that they wanted to tap and put a pipeline down that feed these 4 families. So I did that for them, and it was a good thing for us because it helped us make a little money, and I was able to hire our own daughter to help. It was good all the way around. We got it all done finally. Frank went into his cabin where we piped it in there, and he just took a quart jar and filled it out of the kitchen sink. He told me this story later. I didn't know he'd done that. He took it back to Red Wing, Minnesota. When he got home, he took just a sample of that in a sample bottle and sent it off to the Minnesota State Lab to have it tested. He didn't tell them where it was from. He just sent it from Red Wing. He told me this the next summer, and he showed me the report. And he said, Jerry, it was the funniest thing. He said, after about a week, I said, I got a call. And this is Frank. So he said, I'm from the Minnesota State Water Lab. You sent in a sample of water and we're testing it. And he said, is there a problem? He said, no. But he said, we're having a big argument down here at the lab. And he said, what's the argument about? He said, this is the purest water we have ever tested in the state of Minnesota. Where in Minnesota did you get this water? He said, I didn't. I got it from a little cabin that has a spring out in Montana. And he said, I told these guys this water wasn't from Minnesota. Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes. It has pretty pure water. You want to get someplace where the water is pure and clean. Not only for you, but also for your garden. Because you know what plants do? They suck up everything in the soil. And so it's important to get out in the hills and mountains. And I tell you, you folks are lucky because you live in an area where as far as you can see, it's hills and mountains. Now I know there's problems, governmental regulations, We were talking with some folks. A lot of the hills and mountains are not for sale. If it's anything like Montana, most of Montana is still owned by the federal government because it was too many hills and mountains, basically, and so it wasn't worth homesteading. It never got into the private sector. That is both a blessing and a curse. I go out sometimes in the national forest, you'll find a beautiful little valley. There's a spring gushing out of the side of the mountain. There's virgin trees. It's like, why didn't somebody homestead this place? But you know, those poor people back then, it was homesteaded when there were no chainsaws. There were no roads. Our property was homesteaded without a road to it. The people floated across the river to get to it. I'm so thankful they did. But there are places out there, you need to get as close to a mountain somewhere where you can, where there's been no significant mining or agriculture or whatever, and you still have beautiful, wonderful, pure, distilled snowmelt water. It's so wonderful. We spent a little time just recently, as I mentioned, down in Arizona, and we went to visit he was actually a former teacher of Linda's in Thunderbird Academy. She went to Academy there. They're living in Chloride. Anybody ever been to Chloride, Arizona? I'd heard about it because years ago, you may remember, there was a lady and her family, that wrote a little series of articles on living, I don't know what it was called, living in the country or something. And she was a good writer, and that's why they hired her. And she lived in Chloride, Arizona, and Chloride. Who would live in a town like that? So we wanted to go see it, and we found out he was living in Chloride. He's retired now, of course. And so we stopped by to see Chloride. And I'm a kind of person, I'm not afraid to talk to anybody, and I didn't know anything about town, so I just walked in a place where it said some information. I asked a guy in there if he knew this man. He didn't know him. And I started asking him about the water in the area, the gardening. I want to know if people can garden in Arizona, how's it work, and so on. And he said, well, I don't really know the answer to your question, but I can tell you who knows. It's, what was her name, the first lady? Luann or something. She lives 3 blocks down and 2 blocks up. You can't miss it because she said there's junk in the whole yard. And I said, fine. So I went up there, found her. She wasn't sure, but she said, Leanne can tell you. She's 2 blocks, and we went down to see Leanne. And they're the friendliest people. I got to talking to her husband. He said, well, we don't, I said, what's the water like here? Do you have any wells? I mean, how do you? He said, we get our water from 17 miles away. It's like, man. Because all their water there is contaminated with arsenic and other heavy metals from former mining. And besides that, it's got a lot of chlorine, and it's chloride, after all. We finally found this couple. He was 92, I think now, right? And his wife, I think, was 93. If any of you think you just don't have the energy left to do this, you need to visit these folks. They moved out there because they wanted to be in the country. They wanted to be where it was sunny, and it's cheap. They bought part of the land of the lady who wrote for the review from Chloride because they had to leave because they just couldn't make it financially anymore, and they bought a piece of that property. They built he did a lot of the work himself. It's a nice little house. It was, I can tell you the whole story, how hard it was to find them. But he has a pickup, an old pickup, and a trailer on the back, and he has a water tank, and they drive 17 miles, they did, to get water. He's 92. And they bring it back, and he has a little hose he hooks up, and their home looks perfectly normal inside. But their daughter finally moved closer to them, and they drilled a 500-foot well on her place, and now all they have to do is go down to their daughter's place and truck their water up to their place. Folks, if you want to move to the country, there's a way, as long as you really want to, even in Chloride, Arizona. And I asked all the people around, I said, how do you garden here? This is Arizona, bone dry. And they said, well, what was the guy's name? I'm trying to remember. Ben. Bill, was it Bill? Oh, Bill's the gardener here. I said, well, could I talk to him? Sure enough, we'll call him up. It was a town like Cherryville. Everybody knew everybody. They called him in 5 minutes, the guy was over there. He loved to garden. And so I pumped him for questions for probably a half an hour. How you garden here? He said, you can. But he said, you have to know how, and it's difficult. I said, what do you do from water? He says, I'm getting my water from that well 17 miles away because it's clean, pure water. He worked for the water company. That's what he did for a job. He has a large garden. We didn't actually go see it. He was describing it. But it's costing him $280 a month for the water to water his garden. But he's doing it. And he grows all kinds of stuff. The secret, of course, is it's too dry there to really grow a garden. Even if you water the plants, they dry up. So he's learned, he just puts a mat over, kind of stretched over his whole garden, and he has little misters that go pss, 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 like that all day long. They go up, and it's kind of the matting that you have on a swamp cooler, if you're familiar with the desert country. And it takes a while for that little pss to evaporate, and as it does, it humidifies the plants below and cools them as the air transmits up to the sun, and he has a beautiful garden. You can garden anywhere. I think it's easier in BC than there, and you know. But anyway, mountains, God, I believed, saved the mountains so that at this late date in our history, when most of the land has been used and overused and abused, there's still land left, but it's going to be pretty much in the mountains and the hills if you want to have good land. There's some other reasons. Usually it's cheaper because nobody wanted it. Taxes are lower. Regulations are generally lower. You have natural resources you don't have in other places. I'll show you in the slides tonight. All the stone in our place we got for nothing because it's the Rocky Mountains. And it's everywhere there. And even to this day where we are, you can get a free permit to get stone out of the mountains. So there's a lot of resources. There's timber to build with. And you can build up garden soil. It takes a while. We've been at it for over 30 years now, picking rocks. We have picked literally tons and tons. But we're down to this size now. And it's perfect road gravel. So we've graveled virtually all our roads with the pickings from our garden. I mean, there's a place for, everything we need is on our place. I've always told people it's just all in the wrong places. And you have to sort it all out and so on. So that's another thing. Don't be, like Ellen White said, don't feel deprived if you got to go to the hills and mountains. A lot of people didn't like that. When they bought the land out at PUC, it was like, why are we going clear out here? And you got to realize it was around 1900 that they bought that. It took a long time to get to San Francisco. And how are they going to get people out there to witness to? And yet she told them, this is where the Lord wants us. And how right she was. If they had bought land like 3 miles out of San Francisco at that time, you know what it would be like today? Yeah. Well, Sodom and Gomorrah, that's true. Let's see if there's anything else we were going to go over. Some of the rest that we go over tonight has to do more with the nuts and bolts, and that's really for a non-Sabbath time. Probably one other thing. People have often said that it's almost impossible to move the country today. Land's expensive. To build is terribly expensive. And so eventually people convince themselves it can't be the Lord's will because I just can't afford it, or I just, I'm allergic to gardening or whatever it might be. And a lot of people seem to be. Actually, today, it is easier to move to the country than it's ever been in the past. I used to think, man, I wish I was born in about 1870 or something, and I could have homesteaded when I was 21. And I could have gone to the North Fork Valley and gotten 160 acres for $10 for a filing fee. And there are springs and streams and stuff everywhere. And it would be nice if you could still do that. But today, you can make money faster than what it's required to buy the land if you buy the right land in the right place and the money to build with than those folks could. It was so hard to get there, and it was so hard to get building materials there. I don't really think it was any easier. The only thing easier then is you could have the pick of the litter, so to speak. And I am forever grateful to the people who homesteaded our piece. In fact, they had 5 children. And there's the old homestead shack still on our place, all kind of fallen in. One day, this is many years ago, a 70-year-old lady showed up at our door, knocked on the door and went through, and she says, I think it was Margaret or something, McIntosh. And that name hit me because it was the McIntosh homestead. She said, I was one of the 5 children that grew up in that little cabin over there. And she said, I've always wanted to come back and see what happened to the place. We sat her down in a rocking chair, she was in her 70s, and pumped her with questions for 3 or 4 hours of what it was like in the early days. And I'll tell you, it was rough. Her mother, to prove up, they had to live on the place 7 months out of the year, but Dad worked on the railroad. That's the only way they had any money. And so he parked Mom and 5 kids in this homestead shack in the middle of a wilderness with no road, grizzly bears everywhere, and at that time, wolves and mountain lions and everything. And he left, and he didn't come back for months. Can you imagine the bravery of that woman? There was a spring on the place. That's one reason they put the old cabins right there where a spring runs almost to the back door. So she'd have the kids go out there and just dip water and so on. Her sister and her husband homesteaded next to them. And I noticed when we first got there that the woods was all like this, normal trees, probably 60, 70 feet high. And then in this one spot, they were all about 20 or 30 feet shorter. But they were maybe 30, 40 feet tall or something like that. And I always wondered why that was. She told me why that was. Because the 2 women said, we will not do this unless you guys get off your duff and get out there and clear a path from my cabin to my sister's cabin 50 feet wide. So all I have to do is go out there and we just shake a hanky. She told us this in the window until somebody at the other cabin would notice because there was a grizzly bear here or something like that. We need help. And that's how they communicated. And then when they left, what actually happened is in the late 30s during the Depression, Dad quit paying taxes on the homestead that we have. He was old, the kids didn't really know it, and you couldn't even get to the place. It was worthless as far as they were concerned. He just quit. And it was purchased the year after the Second World War ended for back taxes. The entire homestead, 160 acres, they bought it for $380 some bucks. Again, why wasn't I born? But if I was, I'd be dead by now. I mean, the thing is, everybody, I believe what happened to our property, and I don't have enough time tonight to say all this, so I'll tell you. What happened on our property was that a lady who owned property in the park, which had become a park now, and they didn't want really people living there, and they were trying to run a ranch, and they didn't like it, and so they ended up pushing them out, paid them well, but they lost their property. They came across the river and bought this place for back taxes. And then they were going to develop it into a ranch like they had on the other side, but this gal's husband died. Now she's got this property, no husband, what am I going to do with it? It just sat. I believe, and we met that lady, it was McFarland. She was a wonderful Christian lady too. She was about 80 or something when we first came, and she was doing nothing with it. She had sold it to someone else a year and a half before we showed up. I believe the Lord used her as a Christian lady to hold on to that property so that Linda and I could have it.
Amen.
And I firmly believe, everybody, that if you're still looking for land now or thinking, well, you know, we've got a piece, but maybe it's not the right one, maybe we should have a little more, or we should move a little farther, or whatever. I believe that there is a good piece of property with good water on it, very serviceable and will serve your needs. It has your name on it already. And the Lord's just waiting for you to put in the effort and the work to go get it. Because our property, when we bought it, was not on the market. I was telling people this afternoon, many of the properties of people I've tried to help up the North Fork Adventist, properties are on the market. The best properties often aren't. because they don't need to be. They move like that. As soon as old Fred's had it for 27 years, 40 years or whatever, and he lets the neighbors know, somebody grabs it just like that because it has a beautiful spring on it, has a stream on it, has towering timber on it. I mean, there's something. And I could tell you story after story of people that I know, they got their land without looking on the market, because the way to do it is very simple. You just, first of all, you decide with God's leading what part of the country, Australia, BC, Alabama, I mean, you figure it out for God needs people everywhere, spread out like the salt of the earth. And whatever's best for you and your family and all that, first locate the province or the state or whatever, then zero in on a vast valley. Don't look for a piece first. When you found the right valley, don't go to a realtor right away. Go start knocking on doors. Get to know the people. They know who has had property and what you can grow here and who's got a spring and who's done. And then you'll find there's people out there, kind of like Terry's experience. There's people out there who have a property, but it isn't necessarily on the market. But if they ask him, it's on the market. That's what happens. And so the Lord will work with you. And I think there's plenty of good property left for all of God's people. And the reason is the vast majority of people are going where? They're flocking to the cities, leaving all the good land for you and me.
Or stop the truck on the side of the road.
Yeah, he was telling me his story, how really it was obviously providential.
Amen.
Ours was that way too. The property we offered on the property next to it, which was the sister's homestead. It was still owned by the 5 homestead kids when we came there. It's a beautiful place too. It was 160. Had a quarter-mile riverfront, beautiful springs just like ours has and all that. And it was cheaper, so we made an offer on that. It wasn't on the market. The day we made the offer, the mother, who was still living in a nursing home in Portland, died. I believe the Lord kept her alive. I don't think she died because of it. I think she's lived longer because of it. Because of that, we couldn't get a deed to it for 2 years because it went into this big family thing and, probate and all the rest of it. And the realtor, we were working with a realtor then because he knew the people. It wasn't on the market. He said, I don't know what to do. And he said, well, why don't you look at the property next door? That's what we did. In long and short, the property that we were trying to buy ended up being sold back to the government. So now we own it. I can go get firewood on it, I can get timber on it and everything because it's public land and nobody else can get to it. And when the forest fire came through some years back, it burned most of that and hardly any of ours. Now I know the angels could have, whatever, but the Lord knows the future. And the property we have is way better, but we didn't know that then. So it all worked out, but only, I tell you, we drove thousands of miles. We pounded on tons of doors. We went to every realtor in town eventually, and there was only one that knew anything about country property. All the rest of them just wanted to sell you what they already had, some house we didn't need and all the rest of it. And I think that's the way the Lord has always worked. He makes it difficult to test your faith. But once your faith has been tested and your resolve is absolute, you will find the property that you really need, or you'll find the people to help you develop the one you already have, whatever it might be.